All right. Well, it is 7:30 my time. I'm not sure what time it is everywhere else, but we are going to get started. Thank you all so much for joining us. We're really excited to have you here as part of Just Zero's Waste Free Future Summit. This is the fourth of our 5 sessions. We've had a really great couple of days, but I'm really excited for the conversation we're going to have tonight, focused on zero waste campaigns in action. For those of you unfamiliar, my name is Peter Blair. I'm Just Zero's Policy and Advocacy Director. And I'm joined by a wonderful group of activists that are working in the zero waste space. Yvette Arellano, who is the founder and director of Fenceline Watch. Seema Keshav, who is the founder of Go Green Vernon Hills and Lincolnshire, and is also one of the steering committee members of the Illinois Coalition for Plastic Reduction. And Jennifer Navarra, the program director for Zero Waste Hawai'i Island. And tonight we're going to be talking about what zero waste campaigns look like. Now, before we dive in, just a little bit of housekeeping. This event, like all of our Waste Free Future events, is being recorded. We'll make the recording available for everyone in a little bit. And we are going to have some time for audience Q&A. So if you have any questions as we're having our conversation, please feel free to put those in the Q&A function. But we have a lot to get through, so we're going to jump right in. So I'm going to start with the first question, which is, when we're talking about zero waste, we're really talking about drastically changing the status quo, which is by no means easy. So I'm curious, for all of you, what are the biggest challenges that you face in your work, and how do you try and overcome these? And anyone can feel free to take this one to start.
I can go. Well, firstly, I just wanted to thank Peter, you, and Just Zero for the invitation to be on the panel, and excited to have this discussion and excited to be here with Jennifer and Yvette. So I'll talk about experiences more so from the local level over here. So one of the challenges that I found in terms of recommending zero waste programs is that sometimes it's hard for people to imagine what that zero waste world could look like. And it can feel a little bit overwhelming and cumbersome. There are lots of questions. Who's going to be impacted? What is the cost going to be? Who's going to be responsible? Who's accountable? So some of the things that have worked for us is actually helping people to see what that future can look like, and that the journey to get there. And one of the things that's very obvious but so important is education, and that can just come in so many different forms. When we were recommending to launch a composting and recycling program within our school district, which is basically taking the food waste in the cafeteria and the recycling waste, diverting it from the landfill and sending it for composting and recycling. We spoke to our key stakeholders. We did presentations for our principals, board members, teachers, and etc. And we focused not just on the climate reason behind this, but we also talked about costs and the benefits in terms of learning for our students. And a couple of other things that I'll say is in helping people imagine what that future would look like, it's also important. What was important was to propose a stepwise approach. So we didn't go in with wanting to launch this district-wide, where we talked about a pilot program, and then doing a launch across the districts. And also we connected our schools with funding opportunities, grants, as well as we connected with some of the key stakeholders like our principals and our students to get these moving. So these were some of the ways in which we tried to overcome with the barriers.
Thanks so much, Seema. And yeah, I completely agree. Education is really, really important. For a lot of folks, it's hard to imagine anything different than the system that we're currently operating in. It's really become so ingrained in our society, which is a huge problem. Yvette or Jennifer, do you guys have anything to add?
Yeah, to add to what Seema said, I think that was really well put. It's, I would say that something that makes organizing really difficult is understanding that the general public, just my community, views silence as safety, since no one is saying or sounding the alarm that there are toxics inside of our clothes, inside of kitchenware, inside of bottles, then the assumption is that they're safe, or because I can buy it at the store, it is safe. We don't really have that concept whenever someone is buying something from, let's say, Temu. People are like, oh, well, of course it's not safe. It's probably completely not safe, but we don't categorize things that we can go into a store the same way. And I think that's a shift that takes a lot of education, a lot of outreach. And then secondary, I would say fear. There's a lot of fear around people who are mixed status families trying to testify before permit hearings in communities affected by an increase in plastic production. And so whether it's being in a mixed status family, not knowing the language and, being found out that way, the presence of police officers at the front door greeting people into these permit hearings offers a lot of intimidation, let alone a representative from a facility knocking on your door and saying, hey, I heard you have this problem with our company. Nobody expects that. These are realities that happen on the ground to environmental justice communities all over the country.
Yeah, those are excellent points, Yvette. It really is. I mean, there's so many things in the system that are designed to keep the status quo, and it's really hard for people, even if you want to impact this change, to get involved for a lot of the reasons that you mentioned. Jennifer, anything to add before we move on to our second question?
Yeah, I would, I'd, echo what Seema was sharing about the vision of zero waste. I think that's definitely an obstacle, especially at the state level with many policymakers. They just don't think it's a realistic solution for whatever reason. They're hearing more about waste to energy and these types of, solutions that are really costly. That's what they're hearing, from lobbyists. And so going up against that narrative is difficult. I think another challenge we face in Hawaii is just our isolation. It creates some limitations that, we import 90% of our food, and our products come in with a lot of packaging. We have limited capacity of space to landfill. We have a landfill crisis pretty much on every island. And yet, it's a crisis. Our policymakers are not prioritizing environmental issues, not all of them, but the ones that, we got to get the hearing with the money committees usually. And so that, that's been a challenge on the policy front. And I think there's just across the board a lack of funding and a lack of capacity, especially within our government institutions. So looking at, for example, Department of Health, we in trying to pass packaging bills for EPR bills for packaging legislation, we just don't even see the capacity of DOH to oversee a program, or within our counties, we don't have the capacity. And so one way that we're, working towards overcoming some of that is just supporting, especially at the county level. We've been, the last year really put together a coalition of businesses and nonprofits and government entities to work together towards solutions. We lack infrastructure in Hawaii, really to have any local processing of materials and people power. So, we got to work together as best as can to try and move these issues forward. I think what we do have is a lot of people that are aware of the problem here, because we do have this limitation of capacity, and we do have so people are, there's momentum to solve these problems, which I think is a plus.
Thank you all. And it's interesting to hear that in a lot of ways there's similar themes that you're all facing, but there's also unique challenges that are particular to your community, which can be inspiring, but also very tough to navigate. I think this is a good segue to our next question, which is the reason why we all do this work, right? Which is we do have a waste crisis, and the ways that we produce, consume, and manage resources in this country does impact everyone. But realistically, there are communities that feel these impacts more directly, more frequently, more intensely. And I'm curious, how the work that you're doing impacts the kind of environmental injustice that's inherent in our system, And Yvette, I'd love to start with you if you're comfortable with it, because I know that this is a lot of the work that you're focused on.
Thank you so much for that question. I would say that um, the waste crisis affects us upstream of the plastic waste that ends up in landfills, but simultaneously, we're a massive city that also has to manage that waste. But the Houston Ship Channel produces about 40% of the nation's domestic needs when it comes to chemicals for production. And for us, it's definitely, it hits the core of the work that we do at Fenceline Watch, which is trying to stop toxic multi-generational harm, the kind of toxic harm that not only affects people directly, but then their potential to even have children, their grandchildren, and on and on. And it causes developmental issues, neurological issues, maturation issues, issues with hormone disruption. And ultimately, a conversation I've been wanting to bring forward is water. We're now seeing these false solutions in chemical recycling and plastic production start to need even more water than our local municipalities can handle. And so plastic production is projected to triple by 2060, and it's going to have a considerable impact on our water resources. So we're going to start seeing a lot more of desalination projects come on board in order to produce plastic. So that's simply a third of the world's population is impacted by water scarcity. That's nearly 1.2 billion lives. And so water is such a high vulnerability in so many of our states, including Texas, where we're facing just the petrochemical pollution coming from drilling sites, the wastewater discharge coming from these facilities directly. And we need a fuller understanding over how we're going to protect ourselves now and in the future. The energy sector accounts for about 12% of the world's water use, and 4% of that consumption goes to petrochemical production. The water footprint for chemical recycling and bioplastics is expected to be even higher. So assessing both traditional petrochemical based plastic and proposed alternatives, we need to know what is the impact this is going to have on our water resources, because the conversation around planetary boundaries right now is completely void over the footprint that plastic has. It completely leaves out water intensive processes, virtual water, that's water that goes into the products that we use every day, privatization, and intergenerational held water resources. So even beyond the toxic impact, what are we doing to create safe boundaries around the resources we know that we'll need just as a species in general?
Yeah, those are all excellent points. And the water issue is something that is absolutely terrifying. Most of this country is facing a drought right now. Most of the world is, as you said, facing these water issues. And to think that we're going to be funneling so much of this valuable resource into a false solution to materials that are ultimately contributing to the climate crisis is just absolutely absurd. And the chemical impacts with plastics are really, I think there is this focus now, which is wonderful, that is really paying attention to the upstream side of it, but we've all seen the life cycle assessments that the industry puts that never really show the true pictures, that never really show the full kind of weight of the devastation that they're causing. So I know it's really hard work, and we thank you for doing it. Jennifer, Seema, do you have anything that you guys want to add?
I just say that one of the things that we've tried to become cognizant about is, especially when talking about the plastics issue, to not just talk about it as just a waste issue. So we make sure that we talk about the environmental issues that come with plastic production and the use and disposal of plastics, and how fence-line communities are impacted. So that's something that we've become more aware and cognizant about, as well as trying to to bring in the voices also of these communities when we're thinking about laws and policies and how they impact them. I think that's somewhere where we are starting to put more thought and work into.
In Hawaii, it's really the disposal side. We don't have the manufacturing of plastics and really much of anything in the state. So there are environmental justice issues related to disposal. The Hilo landfill, for example, is online. It was closed several years ago, and it is near to, Native Hawaiian, Department of Hawaiian Homelands. But there's kind of a lack of awareness of the people living around those of the dangers. It's not top of mind. The cost of living and housing and food and those are the struggles that a lot of people are dealing with, and that's what's really top of mind in terms of environmental justice issues in Hawaii. So there's not a lot of awareness around it. And in our work, we wanted to center the perspectives of Native Hawaiian and just local community members in the work that we're doing in terms of building a system that is equitable and accessible to everyone. And it has been a bit of a challenge to even get the focus on. It's just not an issue that's top of mind. And so, but we've had some success. We had to put probably more energy into it than we thought we would have on the outset, but did, have gotten good engagement and input for designing a reusable foodware system in Hilo.
Yeah, and the impacts associated with disposal, I think, are something people are paying attention to more, but we've definitely seen this as a theme throughout our summit and definitely as a theme throughout Just Zero's work, where there still is this concept of away, right? You're throwing something away. And people think of that as just this magical place, but it's a community. It's where people live, and there are impacts associated with disposing these things. And I think we really need to center the conversations around both sides of the environmental justice side of this, the production side and the disposal side. And just for the audience, remember, if you have any questions, we're going to try to get to them, so feel free to put them in the Q&A. But we're going to move on to our third question, which is a little more solution-oriented, which we are seeing a lot of people working in this space. Communities across the country are trying to solve these problems, and one way we've really seen a lot of momentum is passing new laws and policies that are designed to reduce waste, improve real, actual recycling, and hold the companies that are really contributing to the waste and plastic crisis accountable. So I guess the question is, how do you start building the momentum for these types of legislative campaigns? And I know passing legislation is very tough. So how do you deal with the challenges you face when you're trying to pass new laws? And Seema, I know this is a lot of the work that you've been doing in Illinois that you've been trying to lead. So I'd love to start with you.
Yeah, thank you, Peter. So just to give a little bit background and context, a couple of years ago, a few of the environmental groups in Illinois came together to start a coalition called the Coalition for Plastic Reduction. Today, we are about a 45+ member organization that includes environmental groups like the League of Women Voters, Illinois Environmental Council, etc. We also have a lot of the water groups like Alliance of the Great Lakes, Friends of Chicago River, and plus grassroots groups like our Go Green groups. And we've come together to work on legislation to prohibit the production, use, and sale of single-use plastics, as well as on policies that promote a circular economy. So we were successful in the last legislative session in getting a ban on banning state agencies and vendors from purchasing and distributing foam foodware containers. And right now we're building momentum to get a full statewide ban on foodware foam containers. And the way we build momentum within the coalition is by leveraging the strength of our network and getting to grassroots support and holding, for example, constituent meetings with our legislators, writing letters to the editor, working on getting business and restaurant support for a foam ban. But Peter, what I would also like to talk about is legislation that you and I have worked on very, very closely, and that's trying to bring a deposit return law for containers in Illinois. And for our audience who's not very familiar with this type of legislation, it is one of the most effective ways to manage beverage container waste. There's data that shows that beverage containers that have a deposit, their recycling rates are more than double than containers that don't have a deposit. So when this legislation was introduced in the Illinois General Assembly a couple of years ago, within the coalition, we formed a working group. And one of the things that we did was we invited national experts. So we had Peter from Just Zero, Beyond Plastics, Container Recycling Institute, and we came together with the national groups so that we could learn and understand, what worked in some of these other states that have these laws, as well as what are some of the tenets of a good deposit return system. And one of the things I think that we also did, which was a little bit different from campaigning for single-use plastic legislation, was we got into the weeds of the policy, where we worked on bill language, and we negotiated strong provisions in the bill to have a bill that was not just, it was equitable and just, convenient, and it held producers accountable for meeting performance standards. So I would say that, this was a great effort of our coalition members working with different national partners in order to get that done. Now, in terms of challenges with DRS, we've had significant pushback from a lot of the stakeholders, retailers, waste haulers, and we did work on making provisions in the bill to help them come along, to help with the transition period. But we haven't been able to move our stakeholders along on a deposit return system here in Illinois, and it's run in the General Assembly for 2 years now. So I think the next steps for us are probably to get more public support. So go back to education of public, educating our legislators. And I think that also we might have to think about maybe a different strategy from what we have been working on right now. So I think that's a lot of what we've been doing here in Illinois.
Which is great work, and it's been wonderful getting to work with you on the deposit return work. I know it's been frustrating at times, and yeah, we have not been able to move some of the opposition, which is not surprising. A lot of the work we do, we're seeing the same type of interest, the people who have kind of a vested interest in the produce, consume, dispose model. It works for them. They make money off it. They don't have to deal with the consequences of their actions. So it's tough getting them to move. But I know another side of this is kind of trying to get legislators to treat this as a priority, and that can be tough. We've definitely seen that, across the country, trying to make, zero waste and waste issues the top of their priority is not always easy. It takes a lot of education with them too. Jennifer, I know you've done some legislative work in Hawaii where you probably felt that with, both the legislators, and you mentioned the money committees. Those are always really challenging. I don't know if you feel like sharing any of that.
Yeah, I've been working on EPR legislation for packaging for the last 3 years, and I've been so grateful to have your help, Peter, and advisement in that process. Worked with Ted Bolin. He and I have helped to work together to draft legislation, and yeah, we kind of have hit a bit of a wall. And I'd say overall, I see within the zero waste movement a lack of momentum to work on legislative issues, because there are just these barriers inherent in the Hawaii state legislative. It's a very fast period or session. It's 3 months. There's just like a free-for-all of so many bills that get introduced, and you got to work on getting it's a lot of energy. And I can't think of one person that's getting paid to do any kind of environmental legislative work. And so people kind of get burnout and tired. And so unfortunately, I'm not sure that EPR for packaging is something, it's probably not the right time in Hawaii for that. I think recently the state got funding to update the integrated solid waste management plan. There's been conversations on other types of EPR that might have a little bit more momentum behind them right now. And so, yeah, legislation can be frustrating. I think we all know that. And I think we got to be strategic. And, I just actually spoke with Ted over the weekend, and we kind of just decided, like, do we want to go, do we want to put the energy into this another legislative session? We haven't completely decided to not, but yeah, it might not be the right moment. And I think as we start to see the bills that have passed in states get implemented, I think that's going to provide more incentive in Hawaii. We're a tiny state, we're not California. We're not going to shift things or make anyone do anything. And so we really want to see reuse as a priority in Hawaii. And it might be better to just kind of wait and see how things pan out in other states, and wait for like something to energize momentum. Because it takes a lot. It takes the public. It's going to take more than Ted and I to advance a bill. And that's kind of where we're at momentum wise in the state.
Yeah, I definitely hear that. And, no state is California. We don't do a lot of work in California because there are wonderful people doing work there. We participate when we're needed, but it's very hard to take things that some states have done and implement them in other states, because every state is dealing with unique challenges. And Yvette, I know when we're talking about kind of implementing new policies, you've been working at the largest scale there is on the treaty. So I'm curious if you're interested in sharing any of your experiences trying to shape, global policy when it comes to these issues.
Definitely. And the INC5 is going to be held in Busan, South Korea, from November 25th to December 1st. This is the last meeting to basically compile a treaty that is proactive about tackling the plastics crisis. And so the timeline is short. I think something that is not novel to the INC process. But you talk about rulemakings, you talk about, even policy, public input, and where civil society's responsibility or role is diminishing. And it's something that we really have to tackle, because it can't be, just us, right? It can't be the Peters and Seemas and Jennifers. We have to come in mass. And we can't come in mass if we don't have the protections to make sure that that space is left open for any voice who has an opinion on those issues. And so whether it's the Global Plastics Treaty shutting out nonprofit organizations from having a voice and allowing lobbyist interest to come in and infiltrate the process, providing their science, providing their recommendations, is always going to be louder. I think it goes back to something either Seema or Jennifer said. The money that's behind these industries and corporations is immense. So making sure we protect public input, and the public input process is so necessary, because people need to stop feeling disempowered and I don't belong there. I'm not an expert in that room, because you're affected. Not only are you affected, your family's income is affected, your children's future is affected, the air you're breathing is affected, your potential food and future is affected at every step of the way. And so getting involved, whether it's in national federal policy, a local city ordinance, the Global Plastics Treaty, or rules and regulations that all have rulemakings, all of these policies that go in effect have to have rules to kind of stand behind them. And so even coming in and saying, I think that's a good idea, it could become more robust if we, had a very specific working group for farmers, or had a specific working group for children, and allow children to come in and basically have a say in the implementation part. So that's what I would say. I would say that the Global Plastics Treaty has basically shed light on how vulnerable these systems are to corporate takeovers. And if we don't fight for our spot, we're going to lose it. Yeah, thank you for asking your questions, Peter.
No problem. And yeah, the corporate takeover is extremely concerning. And I'm glad you mentioned rulemaking, because that's the whole other side of this, right? That even when you get a law passed, there's that other battle. And that's also where the corporate resources can really influence things, because they have the time and energy to really work on these, in a lot of ways behind closed doors meetings to implement these policies that we all want. But
if I could add to something
yeah.
you said, I think that you made such a succinct point here, and that's I wouldn't say they have the people. They don't have the people. We have the people. They have the money to pay someone from 9 to 5 to be present wherever they need to be. And like folks have said before, a lot of folks in this fight don't get paid to do the advocacy at all. So we have the people and we have the passion. As soon as 5 o'clock hits, I'm telling you, those people are out the door, and I'm glad that they're out the door. But something to keep in mind, don't feel disempowered because they have the money, because that money is very limited. And those folks, it's a job.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. They don't have the passion that we have. And I know we're talking a lot about legislation, and there's a lot of good that comes with legislation, but it also can be frustrating, as we're talking about. But the good news is that new laws are not the only way that folks are trying to create a waste-free future. Outside of legislation, there are other opportunities. There's real work that's happening on the ground. So, Jennifer, I know this is a lot of what you're doing, so I think it makes sense to start with you. But outside of legislation, where do you see progress when it comes to implementing zero waste into everyday life and into the communities that you work with?
Yeah, so really have pivoted from starting out doing a lot of policy work at the state level to now really working at the local level to implement a system to have reusable foodware in Hilo, working with multiple partners. Perpetual is one. They're a US-based nonprofit who's working with multiple cities to provide expertise on how to implement reusable foodware systems, as well as the county and a university Hawaii Sea Grant program, which are both recipients from EPA funding, to put in place the infrastructure and provide technical assistance to businesses to transition over to reuse. And so I think having a demonstration, this is like going back to the first question with Seema, of like, people can't envision zero waste, but people can envision what reuse looks like. We still have, there's the beverage bottle examples that are still happening in some countries, but beyond that, I just don't think people can understand what we're talking about. And if we want to have an EPR for packaging bill in place that prioritizes reuse, I think if we have a demonstration project in Hawaii that shows this is a reuse system that's functioning, and we want to expand this, and we can, reduce this huge amount of waste. Because foodware makes it, you look at every garbage can in a public garbage can, it's usually like cups and maybe, containers of food, and then like some other packaging. And so I think we need to have those demonstration projects to have it then become a part of a policy in the future. Another thing that's happening here in Hawaii County that is exciting is, I think I alluded to it earlier, but just coalition of people working towards other solutions. We really would love to see a resource recovery park or facility here on the island, so we can do more local processing of materials, so we can take glass and grind it into sand, which is something we need here, or keeping cardboard and paper out of the landfill or from having to ship it elsewhere, because we are a volcanic island. We need soil. And so if we can use these commodities to make soil amendments, it's something that is really needed here. The more we can not have to ship things elsewhere and ship them in to this isolated place on the planet, the better. And so that's some of the work that I've been focused on.
That's so incredible. And, it is wonderful hearing these stories about, these programs in action, because in many ways it does feel like when we're talking about this to people who aren't invested in this work, it almost sounds like we're talking about science fiction. We said it at the beginning, but they can't imagine it. And I think you're exactly right that, when we have these programs and we can show the value it brings, not just the environmental, but the community-based values, the jobs, in a lot of ways, the economic growth, it really helps with a lot of legislative work that we're doing. I know Seema and I, with the deposit return system work we've been trying to do in Illinois, we've been trying to get reuse language in the bill, and it's been one of the harder things because a lot of people can't seem to wrap their head around how, I thought this was a recycling program. Why are you talking about reuse? What would this even look like? So I think it is all interconnected. Just before we move on to the next question, Yvette or Seema, anything to add?
Yeah, I just say that I'm really excited about some of the reuse work that's happening around the country. Here in Chicago, the Chicago Bears, they will now have reusable cups for their fans in the premium dining, and I think they have about 8,000 people that subscribe to the premium dining at Soldier Field. So that's exciting to me. And the other thing is the reuse that's happening in schools. And I think that that's so important to try to get these kinds of systems in schools, because once you start having children understand the value of, not wasting, the understanding about how these single-use items can also be harmful to their health. I think that's when, they will take these learnings and take them beyond their school life into their personal lives and their homes. So I'm excited about seeing these two developments.
Yeah, it's always wonderful. I've been to a few concerts recently where they have the reusable cups instead of the single-use ones, and it's always really nice when you walk past the garbage cans. They're not overflowing with these single-use plastics that, in this controlled, closed environment really don't need to exist. That, we're seeing them being emptied and washed on site and then put back into circulation at the place. So it's starting to happen, and it is really exciting. For our next question, I'm not trying to bring us down a little bit, but we've talked around it, but this work can be very, very frustrating. It feels very personal. We know the stakes are incredibly high, the impacts are extremely real, and that, time isn't on our side in the kind of grand scheme of things, when we're talking about climate change, plastic pollution. So a lot of people are probably wondering, they're trying to implement, change in their community. What advice would you give someone that wants to begin advocating for a waste-free future, that wants to begin trying to get involved in the zero waste movement in their community? And this is open to anyone.
I can start. I know when we got started, I guess when 2019, I think, we just started hosting a monthly community meeting, and that really brought people out that had the same passions and concerns as us, and brought us together. And I think that is a good way to find others to then work with and move forward. I think working on your own is really not easy. So that's a way to find people. We also did lots of outreach, at events, and found other allies in that same way. So I think that's a way to get started. I think also learning as much as can. For a couple of years, I was a webinar junkie, and that's how I learned a lot about the issues and the solutions. And so that would be my recommendation as a starting point. And for me, doing this work, it's what makes me feel better about the future, because I think the odds are stacked against us, sadly. It doesn't look good. And I think in a lot of ways, you objectively looked at it, like we've kind of already failed, right? Like our plastic is already full of, or the ocean is already full of plastic. There's already plastic raining down on us, and PFAS and the rainwater. And, it's really gotten to a level of scale that can be quite discouraging. But I think we have no other choice but to keep working towards the world and the vision that we would like to see. We have no other choice to fight for it, because if we don't, who will?
I think that's exactly right. If not us, who? Seema, I saw you came off mute. Anything to add?
Yeah, I'll echo what Jennifer said. That's how I got started as well. Is I found people within the community that were wanting to go on this journey with me. And I would also say is one advice I would have is to start with one thing. It could be getting rid of plastic water bottles in your school, or it could be getting a composting organics pickup for residents within your community. Whatever it is, I think um, starting with that one thing, and then, like Jennifer said, educating yourself. I was also a webinar junkie. I spent and webinars like these are very impactful, and also connecting with other environmental groups in your community, neighboring communities. We also worked with our libraries. We got uh, partnered with environmental clubs, high school students in environmental clubs. So I think getting that community around you and partnering and getting that support is important. And I'll just say one last thing. Like you said, it's tough because sometimes it takes really long to realize your vision. We did a pilot for our composting program in one of the schools in 2019, after which we were told that, we don't think that this would be possible to implement district-wide. But we persisted. And finally, the program launched in 2022. So I'll say be persistent, don't lose hope. It takes time. And in that journey, remember that you're educating people along the way. You're changing people's minds. So that would be my advice.
That is excellent advice. And the persistence really is key. I'm thinking about our keynote the other day with Diane Wilson talking about her decades-long battle against Formosa Plastics, and how often it must have felt like the odds were stacked against her, and how is she going to achieve this change for a community that's desperately needed because of just how devastating what they were doing was. And her persistence was key, and she won the largest Clean Water Act settlement in the history of this country and really put their feet to the fire finally after, just unspeakable evils that they were committing in that area. So persistence is a huge part of it. It can make the work frustrating, but when we do achieve our goals, it really does feel much better. Yvette, anything to add?
Yeah, I would say know that there are so many smart people in the movement, and you don't have to have all those answers. So very much start where you're comfortable, and it doesn't have to be small. You could jump to big right away, and you should not feel insufficient in doing that. So whether it's, going to your civic associations and saying, hey, the meetings could be plastic free, and you start going to thrift stores or ask your community, do you have extra silverware that I can bring over so we're not consistently reusing that, is a great way. So plastic free meetings, getting groups of friends together and doing the plastic brand audits to hold corporations accountable, right? This is what we picked up in our community. These are the companies who are selling us not just the goods, but the raw deal of you handle this trash now. And those plastic brand audits, as small as a step as they may sound, they've been featured in headlines. They've been used at the United Nations Environment Program to hold their feet to the fire. I would say that, expertise comes in different ways. So finding out what your community looks like looks very different from not only state to state, but country to country. So, there are waste picker communities that offer excellent, just like expertise on why is it we can't handle all of this waste. So don't discount anybody in your process, right? Whether they're young, whether they're, waste pickers, whether they're people who work in kitchens at restaurants, everybody has something to add to this narrative. And then I would say, when I say go big, if you're working in schools or if you're a fan of a library, I'm a big fan of the library. It's a free resource that is always in the crosshairs. So working to host repair workshops. I went to my first repair workshop here in Houston not too long ago, and I learned how to put a patch on pants. I've never learned how to work a sewing machine. So finding for those experts, are they retired workers? Are they moms who have skills? Not discounting seniors, and retirement communities, and really valuing those skills because it can be frustrating. This work is endless. If I saw somebody say, what about schools? I would say, don't, schools are very difficult to work with. And some people on this panel have that, have that passion to go for it. In my community, it's really difficult. But boys and girls clubs, YMCAs, areas that already lack services for low resource communities. I went to Boys and Girls Club. I worked at a Boys and Girls Club, and I remember, all people had to do was ask to be a speaker, to ask to hold a workshop, and we would get them space, try to help with materials and so on and so forth. But yeah, there's so many smart people. Don't discount it. Ask questions wherever you don't get an answer that you like. It has a tendency to be that's where you want to be. So no matter how young, you can be at the United Nations speaking to members of different country delegations, or you can be in your community actively reducing waste.
Those are all incredible, excellent points. And yet, you really were hitting this theme that there's no action too small. And a lot of times this work can feel very daunting. We are facing some huge, in many ways, existential problems that can feel very hard to wrap your hands around and get involved with. But there really isn't any action too big or too small. And I love that you said you don't have to start small. If you want to jump right in and shoot for the stars, you should. And I think we've seen a lot of that in this movement, but there's also all of the things you were listing and all of the things that we've talked about that really can be, very accessible. And, the webinars were mentioned, I got my start initially doing a totally different area of environmental law, but I got thrown into the plastic stuff. So I went down the webinar rabbit hole because I had to learn very quick. And it's, there's this wonderful network of groups that are trying to solve this problem, and everyone is very, very open with their resources. So it's a great community to be a part of. I see that we have a couple questions from the audience, and I want to make sure we turn to them. So we touched on one, and one question is, how can we integrate zero waste campaigns into schools more? And I know this is something that we've touched upon. It's tough. I know I can say that, from like a college university standpoint, one of the hard things is dealing with the constant turnover of students. That's something that universities really play off of. It's hard to have people invested in change when they're constantly shuffling their leadership. But, Seema, if you could tell us a little bit more about your experience with the composting program, I think that's a great place to start.
Yeah, I was just a mom that was volunteering in the lunchroom. And I saw the waste, that the food waste and the recycling waste that was happening, that was going to landfill. And I reached out to our principal and I said, what is possible? And she turned it back to me and she said, you tell me what's possible. And I went out and I educated myself. I connected with the Go Green Illinois network, found out what other communities are doing. I brought in other parents, other community members, and we worked. And it wasn't easy, as Yvette said. Even with me being a parent, it wasn't easy. But I would say that having that support of others within the community, and also having allies with key stakeholders. So one of the things that really worked for us is having the support of one of the principals, working with the environmental teachers, connecting with the Girl Scouts troop. So I think, having all of these connections and bringing everybody together was what helped us to actually get to launching the program within all the schools of our school district. So I would say it's very important. I remember, I'll say one last thing. I remember our district superintendent, it was so effective because we took him to a neighboring school district to see how they were doing it. You know, how kindergartners were very meticulously taking their food waste and throwing it into the compost bin. And I think that's when it clicked for him that, you know, it is a possibility. So I think it's doable, even if it takes time.
Yeah, we're just, you want to move on to another question? But
No,
I'll
I was
just
going to see if you guys had anything to add, so jump in.
just starting our work with schools. And I think that there are a lot of charter schools in Hawaii, as well as like Department of Education, you know, public schools. And it's very challenging, I think, to work with the DOE schools, what I'm learning. But there's a little bit more flexibility amongst the charter schools. And so I think putting some focus where there might be more a little less bureaucracy to change might be a way to move things forward. But you know, we're just getting into it, so I'm naively optimistic at this point still. But we'll see. But definitely, you know, our emphasis is on trying to get reuse in the school cafeterias, and found this lady who's really passionate, and she's starting to make, you know, phone calls and find the food managers of the kitchens, and what she's finding is a lot of support. It's within the schools of even the food managers. So I think that's finding those champions within is probably a key to being successful in schools. So that's kind of our strategy right now, is working on finding champions within each school to move forward.
Peter, can I just add one more thing? I think that also cost is a barrier for schools. And one of the things that worked for us is to get grant funding that we were able to bring in a consulting company that was able to design and help implement the program. So I think that looking for those funding opportunities, I think is important also for like the initial investment.
Yeah, and I know on the funding side, I was recently at a hearing in New Jersey where they have a bill that's a combination of skip the stuff, so the, you know, single-use utensils by request, but it also has a component that's trying to, you know, mandate for some big on-site dining establishments, which includes schools, to have reusable food serviceware instead of single-use, because a lot of schools do use single-use materials, and funding was something that was coming up, that there's an interest in the schools, but they don't have the funding for kind of, let alone the materials, but a dishwasher. So, you know, I think grants are a great way to do it. Talked a little bit about it, but EPR for packaging can also be a great way to actually hold the companies that are producing all this single-use nonsense to actually pay for the investments we want to see. But I think a good transition to a next question is, we did get a question about what is reuse system? What is a good reuse system model? We've talked a little bit about reuse, but maybe we should have taken a step back and explained it in a little more detail. So if anyone wants to jump in and explain what reuse is and how it's so central to the zero waste movement.
Well, I think there's different models for reuse. There's the closed loop, you know, which could be a school, right, that has their own reusable trays and silverware, and they're washing them and they're staying in house and circulating within a closed space. Another closed loop example would be the stadium cups that one of you guys mentioned as a program in wherever you, I don't remember who said that, I'm sorry. But that's being implemented in a lot of places. And then there's the open loop system, where generally you need an operator that's going to do the logistical pieces of collecting those containers, you know, consumers will turn them in. For our Hilo program, we hope to make it as convenient as possible and have return bins all over town so people can easily return them. Then you have the operator that picks them up, transports them to a centralized washing facility, and then from there they'd be redistributed back to schools or vendors or whoever to use again. So those are the kind of two basic models. There's all different ways to finance it. So what we're looking at Hilo is a pay per use fee, where instead of try to make it comparable to what they're paying for a single use container is what they pay to reuse a container. And so that's the kind of basic set up. I think we're even trying to look at schools doing that same model. And like you were mentioning, costs. That's what we're trying to get at right now. What are schools paying right now for containers? Because they might be paying very little. It might be difficult to offer them the service model. But most of the DOE schools in Hawaii have like changed their facilities long ago that it would be really expensive and costly to put in a dishwasher and get that infrastructure in place. So having them take advantage of the community system would be an advantage. So, and the other component that's really critical, I think, to all this is having a good return incentive so that we make sure that we're getting the containers back. We can actually have a program that's worse for the environment if we're not getting the containers back and having them circulate. So those are kind of the key components of a reuse system. In a foodware context, I think there's beverage bottles, which kind of, that's a deposit system probably, where you get money back. So we can have a whole webinar on, on reuse, but that's my brief overview.
And it was an excellent overview. And I think this relates a little bit to another question we got in the chat, which is, comparing, I think it was specifically about the water impacts of chemical recycling and reuse. And, the key part of how all of this integrates into zero waste systems is that, Yvette was talking about this with the frontline impacts of the, predominantly plastic production, but there's just a tremendous amount of resources that go into producing a lot of the single-use materials we use. It's very energy intensive, very water intensive, and we use them momentarily and then dispose them in a landfill or incinerator. And oftentimes, if it's not disposed in those, it's just getting leaked into our environment where it's wreaking more havoc. So reuse is so central to this because once these items are in circulation, you can use them over and over and over again. Seema or Yvette, anything to add?
I would say that having a conversation about petrochemicals in Texas, especially West Texas, the heart of fracking, is extremely difficult. But one conversation people are willing to have is the conversation on water and what the fracking is doing to water systems that are meant for not only people's everyday use, but agriculture, livestock. We're talking about cows basically having symptoms, losing patches of hair because the water is so heavily contaminated, people being forced to move from their communities because there is no accessible water, or it has smells of gas, and you have, local municipalities telling you it's all right. Corpus Christi has a massive desalination plant coming its way. It's raised water bills exponentially. This year we received in Houston letters saying, hey, you need to be mindful of your water use. We're capping residential water use at this amount. I want to see the same kind of passion go after industrial processes for the amount of water that they use. So water rates have gone up. It's affecting everyday people's lives. Folks who can't or barely pay their monthly rent and groceries are going to start being slapped with bills on waste management, honestly, and on water bills. So these are two things that are going to be inhibiting folks every days. Just wanted to add some context to what I said about water earlier.
I very much appreciate that context. And we are very close to time, but we got a question that I feel like we have to ask, which is, you're all doing incredible work. You're all doing such important work. And we got a question, which is, are there ways to get involved with any of your organizations?
Don't all jump at once. Yeah, I'd be open to talking to anyone. I mean, we live in a Zoom verse now. People, I mean, some of my interns are working remotely, so if anyone is interested in helping out, be willing to see how they might contribute.
Yeah, likewise. I mean, we have the Illinois Coalition for Plastic Reduction. I think Peter, someone put the link in the chat. And we're always looking for more members within the state to help us with our legislative campaigns. and always looking to collaborate, you know, and learn from each other. So if there's anyone interested in learning the work that we're doing, whether it's at the state level or even here at a local level within our communities, we're willing to get on, have a conversation.
Yeah, I would say if you got a little bit of time, if you can do Canva design work, flyers, Instagram design, you know, I'll give you what needs to go on that flyer. But you know, these skills are so important and can add capacity to small organizations. If you can speak another language and are open to translating or checking over translations, it's extremely helpful. If you know how to work the back end of a website, of a WordPress website, hit me up. There's endless opportunities, and your expertise. I'm not expecting anybody who signs up to volunteer to jump into like some knee-deep stuff unless you want to. And also, you know, drafting up EJ screens, you know, we'll show you how to work the databases. We just have a list of communities that we need to draw maps around using EPA tools. So there's definitely opportunities. Hit us up on www.fencelinewatch.org. You know, I hate the platform, but you know, we're on Twitter. That's probably where we keep stuff most up to date. And one last thing I'd say is we're not a nonprofit. We are not a 501c3. We are a fiscally sponsored project. So if you feel very passionate about this work and have a couple friends you want to go in on this with, and you have been working with an organization, you know, whether it's Just Zero, whether it's Gaia, whether it's, you know, Plan or any organization, and you come to them and say, hey, me and this group of folks have a plan for some work, and this is how we want to guide this work. We need somebody to sponsor us. We don't need a 501c3, but can you offer us administrative support, financial, tax support, legal support? That's called a fiscally sponsored project. So grab that courage that you have, grab a couple friends, throw it at an organization and see how they take it, right? You have friends in the movement. People want to see folks succeed, and we need more people to get engaged.
Yeah, I just want to echo that we're also a fiscally sponsored organization. So it takes a lot of that administrative stuff off of our plate. We can do the work. But, you know, for years we were just a community group. And actually there's a lot of freedom in that. We had to give up a lot in the policy realm. Like I didn't mention it, but I don't do my policy work under Zero Waste Hawai'i Island anymore because there's a lot of limitations. So you can do a lot, and advocacy is easier. You don't need to get paid. It's easier to be unorganized, or not unorganized, but not as a part of a nonprofit.
Well, thank you all so much. We really appreciate your time. Thank you so much for joining us. I think this was an excellent conversation. I wish it was an 8:30 p.m. on the Eastern time because I'm feeling very energized after our conversation. And thank you to everyone who tuned in. We really appreciate your time for participating with Just Zero's Zero Waste Waste-Free Future Summit. Almost got it wrong. We're continuing tomorrow. We have our final session. It is on the future of zero waste advocacy. We hope you can join us, but I hope wherever you are, you have a wonderful rest of your day. And thank you again to our panelists. We really appreciate you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.